Good morning and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another session of seminar from IndieSerix Toronto. And today we have a very exciting topic from Shiva to Schrödinger, unraveling cosmic secrets with Trika Shaivism and quantum insights. The topic offers a revelatory journey into the teachings of Trika Shaivism and their remarkable alignment with discoveries of modern quantum physics. This thought-provoking book demonstrates how the profound insights of this Shaiva ancient spiritual tradition predate and parallel the concepts emerging from the world of quantum mechanics. Today, our speaker, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar is one of our first online speakers going back from 2020. And he completed his PhD from Cambridge University. Currently, he is the Adjunct Faculty at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru in India and Assistant Professor at Amrita Vishwavidyapeetham Delhi NCR region. He is the National Founder-Convenor of Mandala, the National Aayam of Vijnana Bharati, which looks at the intersection of epistemological and ontological resonances of Bharatiya Jñāna Pranali and modern science. His documentary on quantum mechanics aired on Doordarshan under the Science India initiative. So welcome, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar. Thank you for, and you can begin now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Yes, I do very fondly recall that I was one of the first speakers, I believe, for the Indic Studies Toronto group. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of celebratory firework in my background. I hope that subsides very soon. So today's discussion, is on this book that I have recently come out with, which has been published by Hay House under the Penguin Random House umbrella organization. And the idea behind this book is primarily to understand, there has been a lot of discussion about the ontological and epistemological resonances of modern science and Indic thought. And it has been done in a multiplicity of ways as such, but there hasn't been as much. There's Subhash Kagji, who has looked at some aspects of the Shaiva perspective of non-dualism, so to say. Besides him, there hasn't been all that much of an exploration thereof. And this came to me in a certain sequence of events which happened, which inspired and motivated me to go in this direction. So we'll come to that. But before doing so, I'd like to share my slides. I hope they will be visible. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I'll be talking about what I call a fabric of flux, right? These terms rather, they are quite contradictory. They're quite paradoxical. How can there be a fabric which is flux? If there is flux, what is the fabric, right? And what do I mean by this, right? So fabric, of course, talks about a firmament. It talks about certain things that connect, right? Different threads, for instance, different parts of this, whatever is part of that fabric, essentially. And flux, of course, is to do with, change, right? Dynamism, so to say. And a fabric of flux basically is talking about certain fundamental aspects of reality itself, which have been explored through various, perspectives, various philosophical systems over the years, over millennia. But interestingly, it has been done in certain very specific ways within the Bharatiya Jñāna Parampara, which give us insights which are often very counterintuitive. For instance, they are often very paradoxical, and they do resonate in some form, let's say, with certain foundational ideas. I'll be very careful in my phrasing, mind you, because, being from a scientific background and knowing where we fall short of, our experimental results, let's say, or the constructions thereof. So the same thing applies for this as well. So I wouldn't like to blindly connect the dots, of course, and do have an entire section in my book, for that matter, on how divergences have need to be considered when we are talking about these two, disparate schools of philosophy, so to say. So the fabric of flux, right? So the first question that comes to mind is, what is reality, right? And I think I had so this has been something which has been there throughout, right? Even from in my first discussion or lecture or talk out here in the Indic Studies group, I think I had started with something similar. And the idea is that that is what fascinates me, right? And that is what I think fascinates, everyone at some point or the other. So it encompasses everything from, let's say, the skies, the cosmos, essentially. That's a very beautiful picture of a nebulae, which has been captured by NASA, if I'm not mistaken. Then you have things like, for instance, stones skipping on water, right? And different kinds of ripples. Sometimes they are also asymmetric ripples that can form because of sediments and various other reasons, so to say. And so we have often seen we have often tried to do this when we have, let's say, gone camping or, gone to some next to some reservoir as such. The third picture here is something that really fascinates me and, till this day, and fascinated me as a young lad as well, which is to do with the iridescence of oil slicks, right? So this is, when you have the optical effect whereby you see the multiplicity of colors. So it's almost like you have a rainbow on the, on the terra firma, on the ground, essentially, right? Now, the fourth one is put there because, I mean, it's very interesting, the stage we are in terms of reality or understanding of reality. Of course, there is, artificial intelligence, there is augmented reality, so to say. So there is a certain kind of digitized interfacing of what we consider as reality. And with the Nobel Prize for Physics this year going to neural networks by Hopfield and Hinton, there is obviously a lot of discussion about what is and how does reality inform our, next frontiers of information dynamics, and where the information dynamics themselves can lead to, different insights when it comes to reality, so to say, right? So there's a whole bunch of phenomena, a whole bunch of regimes, so to say, where reality exists, and there are, of course, various different ways to approach this. There are different conceptual frameworks, so to say. So this, I think, is something that I had, not this exactly, but I had shared something similar at some point. There's some chat as well. Let me just check if there's some question. Okay, yeah, I'll put the details very soon. So the interface of immiscible liquids, right? So all of the things that you see on the top, right, are what we consider as, we can consider as classical physics, right? I mean, where, for instance, different fluids essentially come together, and they're very interesting interface effects that you can study. So during my master's year in Cambridge, we had studied about the field theory, so to say, of fluids, right? Can we make something of that kind, with respect to, looking at units of rotation or different kinds of fluidic kind of movements, right, in such systems. Then you have something known as the Lissauges patterns. Those of you, if, have come across, physics labs, you will find this very interesting thing that you can make when you have two perpendicular, harmonic motions, which are coinciding, which are superimposing. Then you basically have a cumulative effect, which comes out in very interesting ways. And you can make this happen with even sand, right? So there's a very well-known kind of demonstration that had been done in the Cavendish laboratory. And I think it's done more widely across the world. This is called the Lissauges patterns. And so classical mechanics and harmonic motion basically coming together. And of course, you have the very famous, experiment with the Faraday's cage, where you can have a very well-dressed man, not at all, under the threat of being electrocuted in any shape or form by this high voltage discharge, right, which comes across, and there's obviously shielding, which happens with respect to classical electrodynamics. So all of that was going on, right, till the point that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a revolution of sorts, right? So we had two different regimes of science or nature, which was explored. One with respect to extremely high velocities, right? Extremely high speeds, comparable not quite actually, but we looked at light as something we took as a reference, of course. And then there was the idea of the minutest of layers of reality, right? And here I have shown you a biological sample, but do believe me that it's much more minute than that in various cases. And what happens in the physics of that regime, so to say, right? So that's where we were placed. So classical physics is just the half above, and then there is the rest of it, one part of it, which we'll be discussing in this talk today. Right. So we had, sorry, yeah. So this I do like to put here because I think this is a very humbling kind of quotation, and I have always, taken this as something we should all remember as, those of us who are in the sciences. There is always a certain divergence of a thought of how we kind of look at nature. And at the turn of the 20th century, there was a certain level of smugness, arrogance, you could call it self-assuredness, so to say. And I would like you to kind of look at the last line there, which is that an eminent physicist remarked that the future truths of physical science are to be looked for in the sixth place of decimals, right? So there's a little bit of debate whether Albert Michelson said this in 1894, or there was, some people say Lord Raleigh. There are a lot of discussions on that. Notwithstanding, there is a little bit of, humbling thought that comes across in this quotation, right? And then in about a decade or so, you had the Annus Mirabilis, right? Einstein's year of miracles. And you can see the original papers, the 4 papers that came out that year. Photoelectric effect with respect to special relativity, Brownian motion, and mass energy equivalence, right? And it was actually for the photoelectric effect that Einstein got the Nobel Prize for physics as well. Now, when we talk about India, right, and the ways in which we looked at, the nature of reality, right? That's been the question for physicists, and that's been the question for philosophers. And everybody has had a different mode of accessing this understanding. And usually there is an idea which is very beautiful, which is to do with self-similarity, in the sense that whenever there is a certain occurrence, right, in nature, which is resonated or is seen across different scales, right? So in physics, for instance, we have something known as the inverse square law, right? That is seen in classical, for instance, Coulomb interactions and so on and so forth. And then you can also have it in Newtonian gravity for that matter. And so there are various interesting patterns, there are various interesting insights we can get about the nature of reality, and which often is self-similar as well. And in the ancient past, we have had different ways of again, looking at the nature of reality. And there have been very systematic ways of doing so, right? So we are all aware of some of them. And I wouldn't be going into 3 of the 4 that I mentioned here, but nonetheless, I think I should discuss it briefly. So of course, in Nyaya Vaisheshik, you have a certain categories-based approach where there are various different kinds of ontological and epistemological categories, right? So for instance, the Vaisheshik, in the Vaisheshik darshan, you have categories for dravya, for dravya meaning substance, for instance, action, right, karma, guna, and then you have samvaya, vishesha. There are various kinds of categories that exist. In the case of Nyaya, it is more to do with, for instance, epistemology, right, and ways of presenting positions or arguments or statements, so to say, within, while trying to understand the nature of reality, right? Sankhya is obviously looks at the empirical spiritual dualism, right? Where you have the worldly aspect, which has been looked at in the case of Prakriti, and Purusha, of course, is to do with the spiritual aspect. There was a very interesting discussion I was having with Professor Ramnath Jha the other day from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, a very eminent scholar of Sanskrit, about the divergences of Sankhya and Vedanta, which come with respect to the concept of ahankara, right, which is the idea of ego or ego consciousness. He had a certain point of view which was more inclined to Vedanta on that front. But that's for another discussion. Then in Mimamsa, you have orthopraxy, which is more to do with rituals, with respect to rituals-based thinking and how they can be devised and harnessed for spiritual progress, essentially. And within Vedanta, of course, you have varying degrees of dualism and non-dualism, right? So a lot of my talk will be based on this. I've just given a few of these original kind of manuscript snippets, right, for Vaisheshik Sutra, for Sankhya Karika, and for the Brahma Sutra, right? So these belong to, of course, respectively to the Nyaya Vaisheshik school of thought, Sankhya, as well as Vedanta, right? So now, so one of the main things when we talk about the nature of reality is to do with the subject-object binary, right? What do I mean by that? Whenever we are talking about the nature of reality, the first thing that comes to mind is how do we define a system, right? How do we define the boundary between what is, let's say, defined in terms of a cohesive unit and what is beyond it, essentially? In the past, we have looked at it more from a subjective, objective kind of aspect, in the sense of how we perceive reality and what is the center or what is the subject of, rather the object of perception, right? And that has been a fundamental aspect of how we have perceived the nature of reality. And therefore, the idea of the subject-object binary is something which has been, very much the center point of many of these deliberations and discussions when it comes to the Bharatiya Jñāna Parampara, and also with respect to Trika Shaivism, which I'll be coming to shortly. Right, so the subject-object binary, when we talk about the philosophical distinction, is basically between this, that an entity that possesses the agency, the consciousness to kind of look at or observe, so to say, certain center of observation, and the object is the center of observation, which is perceived or acted upon by the subject, right? So you have basically, there are many different ways in which this has been looked at in Western thought. I'll briefly touch upon some of them. From the perspective of Indian philosophy, this has been looked at from a more integrated lens, in the sense that it has been looked at from the underlying unity between the subject and the object, especially when it comes to non-dualistic schools of thought, such as Advaita Vedanta, of course, and as well as Trika Shaivism. And so this perspective, of course, looks at a more unity-oriented or interconnected aspect of reality without the illusion of separation, as it is called, within these schools of thought. And of course, there is a very famous example which is given in Advaita Vedanta, which is to do with the pot and the clay, right? Whether the clay, when it is in the form of the pot, how do we describe the relation, the relation of inherence, and the connection between what is and what was it made of, essentially, right? So in the case of our reality, it is basically about Brahman, right? The ultimate reality and the multiplicity of forms and entities that take place or that are formed in the universe, that come about in the universe. So in the subject-object binary, as I mentioned, I'll quickly touch upon some of the Western schools of thought and how they have not quite been, all the way been able to address various aspects of it. So if you look at Western philosophy, you have various kinds of post-structuralist thinkers, right? You have Foucault, you have Derrida, you have Butler as well. And interestingly, they have, questioned the claim of this subject-object binary to being always universal, right? So this idea that it is always there in different kinds of systems. And in fact, they have given a political flavor to it as well, talking about power dynamics and how, certain perspectives can often be marginalized when we talk about the subject-object binary, right? Foucault, interestingly, looks at the idea of the definition of the individual in a way which I, found out in a shloka in a Shiva Sutra. So I just wanted to highlight this quotation. So it is my hypothesis that the individual is not a pre-given entity which is seized on by the exercise of power. The individual with his identity and characteristics is the product of a relation of power exercised over bodies, multiplicities, movements, desires, and forces, right? So there's a very it's almost like a contextual negotiation of what is the individual with respect to the identity and the characteristics. Foucault, of course, again spoke about the analysis of power relations. He looked at the way in which the subjects are positioned and the objects are constructed by the subject as such. Derrida, again spoke about the inherent instability of language and meaning, right? So there's a very famous example when we talk about Derrida's deconstruction, which is that of a vehicle, right? So vehicle, if I were to give you a picture of the vehicle, there is a components-based approach to describing what a vehicle is, but there is also a very contextual and a functional manner of doing so, which is often very fluidic, right? So there is a fluidic relationship, right, of meaning formation, which is very, very important. And he famously said, that is what deconstruction is made of, not the mixture, but the tension between memory, fidelity, the preservation of something that has been given to us, and at the same time, heterogeneity, something absolutely new and a break, right? So he talks about how we think about different categories of objects and realities, so to say. right? So a very interesting way of kind of looking at things in the Western context. And so this idea of the subject-object binary also in the 20th century was expanded upon by people like John Searles, who spoke about something called as institutional facts, right? So there was a famous paper, The Construction of Social Reality, in 1995, where he talks about institutional facts. And the idea was, to give you an example, a cricket board, right? A scorecard, essentially, right? So you have a certain number of runs, a certain number of balls bowled, different, parameters and statistical points. Now, they in general are basically relating to what he calls as brute facts, which is that things which are actually taking place on the ground, right? So they are actual, there's a person going from one end of the cricketing, the pitch to another, taking a run, and therefore that's reflected on it, right? But the very fact that that movement is being annotated one run, so to say, right, is an institutionalized aspect, right? There's an institutionalized, definition, so to say, right? So, he spoke about this idea that there are brute facts and then there are institutional facts. And that often is very, very contextual again, right? And it's not something which is sacrosanct or absolute, right? So he talks about it as ontologically subjective, right? Epistemologically objective. What does it mean? That ontologically, what it means, essentially what it implies, the existence of that is something which is, there is a certain degree of subjectivity to it. And in terms of what it describes, what it is helping in terms of the epistemological aspect, right? There is a clear-cut kind of objectivity to it, right? So there's a very interesting way of defining this idea of institutional facts, right? So another example is money, right? Notes, currencies, for instance. There's no inherent objective fact as such, although through collective agreement, we talk about a certain idea which is, followed in society, right? So just to quickly go over this, I wouldn't spend too much time on it. So you have people like idealists like George Berkeley, right, who talks about the existence of objects depending on the subject, right? So from this standpoint, this is much more intricate, the way in which we look at, how the subject-object binary is defined. Empiricism, we all know about John Locke and David Hume. They are people who have talked about how the role of the senses is very important in acquiring knowledge, right? So if they look at, let's say, this person kicking the ball, right? They will say that beforehand, before actually seeing the act of hitting the ball, there is no rational way from the scratch that you can actually go about with understanding the response that will happen, right, of the ball, so to say. Whereas a rationalist, right, like for instance, there are many who talk about Descartes and Kant, for instance, that there is an independent existence of that reality, right? So there is a rational way in which one can reason out the response of certain systems, so to say, right? So René Descartes, for instance, famously once said, and this is the very extreme of taking that, I suppose, therefore, that all things I see are illusions. I believe that nothing has existed of everything my lying memory tells me. I think I have no senses. I believe that body shape, extension, motion, location are functions. What is there then that can be taken as true? Perhaps only this thing, that nothing at all is certain, right? So a very, very kind of, contextual way of looking at things and completely actually negating the inherent reality of anything whatsoever, right? So now coming to the, so that is how we have been looking at it from the Western perspective. Now, if we talk about Indian knowledge systems, and I being from quantum mechanics, of course, have been very fascinated, and I'll come back to this whole idea of how quantum mechanics came about. If you recall the very first slide, I had talked about the way in which physics had evolved from the classical school of thought. There were a number of different, developments thereof, right, in terms of how we perceive nature. For instance, the idea of determinism, right? The idea of determinism being that if you were to, let's say, roll a ball, right, and you were to know the laws of mechanics, so to say, there's a very definite way in which you could, in principle, speak about the state of the ball in terms of its position and momentum, let's say, after a certain point in time, right, in a fairly deterministic manner. That was, of course, questioned, right? There was a certain idea that nature no longer was deterministic in the quantum realm, and I'll come to that shortly. And then there was the idea that there is an inherent uncertainty in terms of the system itself, right? Which was, again came into the picture. And so quantum theory, one very important thing in that area was also to do with the idea of the observer, right? So the act of observation is often looked at as something which does not quite affect or influence the reality, so to say, right? So for instance, if I were to look at this table, my observation doesn't quite change its color or doesn't determine even the color, so to say, right? Whereas this was not the case when it came to the quantum, realm, essentially, because there was an importance of the observer when it came to, influence is the wrong word, but determining the trajectory in which reality evolved, so to say, in a manner of speaking, right? Blurring the lines between the subject and the object. And in fact, even more so when we talk about entanglement, which I'll be talking about shortly. And so, in fact, Stephen Hawking, in one of his recent works, his last major work, The Grand Design, said, quantum physics tells us that no matter how thorough our observation of the present, the unobserved past, like the future, is indefinite and exists only as a spectrum of possibilities, right? So he talks about how nature, the way in which the trajectories of objects in nature come about or move ahead, that is again dependent on the subject object kind of interaction, and even correlation, so to say, right? So there is an interesting, before I go into the Indic kind of perspective, and I'll go full on, headlong into that, there is this theory which is to do with the sign. It's called the modern sign theory. And the idea is that of interpretations, right? Interpretations. So you see this on your left-hand side, you see this, this triangle, so to say. So the idea is that a sign is basically a key, right? A key to kind of help you interpret something, right? So the representaman is basically the sign, the key of what helps you to interpret a certain kind of object that you're seeing. The object is, of course, what the sign is referring to, and the interpretant is what is trying to derive the meaning from the sign, right? So there is a certain way in which Charles Peirce looked at how this can help in terms of semiotics, right? Meaning formation of interpretations, so to say. And it is not only with respect to certain specific representations, there are many different ways in which the same reality, right, can be interpreted and represented even within, for instance, the scientific parlance in the scientific frameworks. And that is of vital importance in our discussion, so to say, right? So the sign theory, the contextual interpretation aspect is quite important, right? Now, this sign theory was something which Mario di Amato, right, spoke of as well. And he, interestingly, there is a certain work which was on, that is the first place where I saw a certain resonance or a certain divergence from Indic thought, where D'Amato is, contrasting this idea of sign theory with Buddhist idea, right? The Mahayana text, Mahayana Sutra Lamkara, which seeks to look at semiosis, meaning formation, through either perfect realization or a complete stoppage or complete cessation of semiosis altogether, right? So there is a very interesting way in which that happens. And in Trika Shaivism, as we'll see, this whole idea of sign formation, the sign, the interpretant, and the representaman are very much part of the very same kind of fabric, so to say. And there is no aspect of the illusory, veil, so to say, which we often see in Advaita Vedanta. There is a much more kind of dynamic way in which this has been spoken of, essentially, right? So the subject-object binary, again, looks at an experiential aspect in the Indic knowledge systems. In the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, for instance, it talks about how knowledge is better than mechanical practice, right? And then even better than that is meditation, right? So dhyanam. So for instance, jnana bhyasa, jnana dhyanam visheshyate, right? So you have basically the idea that it is better than, knowledge is better than mechanical practice. And then you have that being even what is better is meditation, right? Dhyanam. So this idea of how this distinction basically gets removed, right? That has been a center point of a lot of discussions in the Indic knowledge systems, right? So for instance, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jain Darshan talk about it in terms of Advaita, Shunyata, Anikantavad, right? Anikantavad, there is a very well-known parable that I'm sure many of you have heard about, which is to do with the blind men and the elephant, right? Where every man is allowed to touch a certain part of the elephant. And of course, the person who's looking at the trunk is somebody who thinks that it's a snake, right? Somebody with the feet is obviously thinking of it as a pillar, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a multifaceted aspect of nature, and you have conflicting views at times, but there is a certain reconciliation that, unless you get the entire picture, seems often very, very counterintuitive, contradictory even, right? So how can a pillar, for instance, be the same as a snake or as a wall, for instance, which a person touching the side of the elephant would have probably assumed, right? So that's an interesting perspective from a parable that has been shared often in Anekantavad. Now, we come to the Trika Shaivism aspect, right? So before we get into the Trika aspect of things, the Shiva Sutra obviously looks at the awareness of pure consciousness as something which helps in mediating this, divide, right? So this divide, so to say, tadara ruda pramite satakshaya jiva sankshaya, right? So that is where you have basically the idea that there is a aspect of consciousness. Pramite, you may have heard about the idea of pramite, prameya, and pramana, right? So in respect to that, you have this idea of how the consciousness is basically leading to a certain idea of the resolution of all the conditionings and constraints. Now, in Trika Shaivism, there is a way in which there is an illusion again, right? There is an illusion which is still spoken of, right? But it is not spoken of in the way in which it is spoken of in Advaita. And I'll come to that shortly. There's an entire slide I have kept for that. Now, this perceived separation basically is what leads to a lot of suffering, right? We have often heard about Buddhism talking about suffering from the idea of attachment, right? Idea of identification with certain falsehoods, essentially. In Trika Shaivism, this has also been spoken of, and very much so. For instance, in the Shatrim Shatat Vasandoha, right? There is a very famous kind of line where you see the first kind of discussion of Anuttara Murti, right? Anuttara Murti is basically the way in which they're talking about the highest reality, right? So Yad Yamunottaru Murti, right? And then you have Jagat Sashtrum, right? Paspande Saspandaha Prathama Shiva Tattva Muchyate Tagyai, right? So here basically the idea that Anuttara Murti is basically what is leading to all the world that we see around us. And there's a vibration at the very beginning, right? This is first vibration, right? According to those who understand this idea of Anuttara Murti, is what gives an understanding of the Shiva Tattva, right? The idea, the essence of Shiva, basically, right? So Shiva Tattva Muchyate, right? So this non-dualistic perspective is what is being spoken about throughout, essentially, in Shaiva Parampara, as well as within the Trika fold as well. Now, when we talk about the Spanda Karika, right, then there is also this further, it has been taken further in terms of looking at the idea of agitation, right? Agitation, and how that can only be dissolved using the understanding of the supreme state of consciousness, right? So Syat Paramam Padam, right? Nija Shuddhyai Samarthasya Kartavyasya Bhalishan Shadaha Yada Shobha Praliyate Tada Syat Paramam Padam, right? So you have, for instance, the idea of Nija Shuddhyai, right? Nija Shuddhyai, and there is a certain aspect of Kartavya, right? And then Syat Paramam Padam. So the whole idea of how you kind of can go ahead with the dissolution of the agitation or even the state of impurity, so to say, within oneself and go towards a purifying kind of aspect, so to say, right? But I'll just briefly touch upon these aspects because the way in which I have tried to look at the metaphysics of it does not quite look at as much the practices as much as the underlying premises for why they have said it in the way they have, right? So if we go forward, the idea of dynamism, right? We started with this idea of dynamism, but the idea of stillness, right? If everything is still, oftentimes if you see, right, in nature, the idea of stillness has often been spoken of in terms of connections or the underlying unity, right? When we talk about, for instance, Vishnu, right, in various other, schools of thought and in general, right, there is this idea of him lying on this ocean of consciousness, right? And there is a certain stillness, so to say, and that is where there is a dissolution of distinctions in appearance, right? How the perceived differences, altogether get removed. However, there is a very interesting line in the Shiva Sutra, which talks about when this dissolution happens, right? How the enlightened seeker is actually, in a way, igniting or bringing about a certain creative power, right? So, for instance, bhed tiraskare sarganta karmatvam, right? So, you have this idea of bhed tiraskare, right? Bhed is the differences, right? When you kind of differentiate within something. Tiraskare is, of course, to kind of, put aside, essentially. Tiraskar karna, we often speak about tiraskar in the common parlance, but in this context, it's the dissolution of the perceived differences. right? And so there is an inherent creativity that has been spoken of, which is very interesting for me, because there are areas of modern science as well, where we see that the correlative aspect often gives rise to emergence, right? So emergent phenomena and so on and so forth. But just briefly wanted to touch upon this very interesting shloka that I had found during my research and work. And so in Trika Shaivism, the idea of the individual soul is often looked at through the prism of cosmic energies, right? Matrika Shaktis. And this, the agency of these Shaktis are both Bahya, right, which is external faculties, and the Antahkaran, right, the internal faculties as well. Now, Abhinav Gupta, and I will come to his contribution shortly about in a little more detail, but Abhinav Gupta, Acharya Abhinav Gupta rather, is one of the most prominent kind of proponents of the Trika Shaivism. And he talks about a lot of things. I mean, I'll come to one which is very interesting. But at the beginning, he talks about, of course, the idea of the identification of the supreme, right? And there he is talking about in Tantra Lok, right? In Tantra Lok, which is one of his most well-known works, the true nature of the three, right? Now, this idea of the three has been spoken of in terms of many different sets of three as well. But in this context, it has to do with Shiva Shakti and the Nar aspect as well. There is Para Apara and Para Apara as well. I'll come to the definitions thereof, but there is always a set of three in which it has been spoken of, right? Sometimes in terms of the immediate and the universal and the intermediate. Sometimes in terms of the Shiva and the Shakti and the combinations thereof, the interactions thereof, right? And so this process, which has been spoken of as unconditioned emanation, right? The perception of the Supreme in its entirety, in the way it is, right? That has been spoken of in terms of, in the Tantra Loka, right? So there is a line where he talks about Anutare again, right? You see that, and Vimarshanam. Vimarshanam is when you have Vimarsha, Vishwam Vimarshanam, right? When you see the entire universe manifested through the reflection, Vimarsha, of this supreme reality, right? And so when this happens, then the yogi is said to be having completely overcome Maya, right? And had a comprehensive victory, so to say, right? That is what has been spoken of in the Shiva Sutra. Now, in Abhinav Gupta's Paramartha Sar, right, there's a very interesting illustration, right? So the illustration is with respect to a crystal, right? A pure crystal, and how it reflects different kinds of colors, right? So the Shiva, for instance, is like, the crystal who, gives rise to the various forms. And so you see, Nana Vidha Varnanam Rupam Dhate Yathamala Sphatikaha. Now, Sphatika, those of you who are familiar with this term, is what has been spoken of here as the crystal, right? And Nana Vidh Varnanam, Nana Vidh Varnanam, which is basically when you have Varna, Varna is being spoken of in terms of colors, right? So you all will be familiar with this term, right? So that is what has been spoken of when we talk about Abhinav Gupta's perception of a reality as a multiplicity of the hues, right, which come about from the reflections of the supreme reality. Now, in Swatantriya Sutra Vritti, right, there is this idea that what is being kind of reflected throughout remains as self-awareness, right? That is manifested as self-awareness, as well as the idea of the universe, right? Now, the self-awareness, right, is something which has two layers to it, right? So self-awareness is, of course, S with the small s and S with the capital S, right? With the capital S, it's talking about the reality in a more broader sense. And with the smaller s, it's, of course, talking about the more localized sense, so to say. Right, so it talks about how that carries through, right, in all the things that we see around us. And there is a more immediate way in which the connection between Shiva, right, the ultimate reality, is being seen with respect to the multiplicity of things that we see around us, right? So in another very seminal text, the Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, right, there is the direct perception is being spoken of, right? And there is an interconnected vision, right, where you have different forms that come across in the same unified whole, right? Vivek Thabha Bhava Ek Pramatari, right? So there is a whole idea that, and if you look at the very end, Sambandha Dhipadam, right? Sambandha Dhipadam basically talks about the relationships between the different realities or the different elements of reality, so to say, right? In the Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, there is also the idea that whatever we see around us, and this is a very important point number 4, right? Exists in its ultimate form and remains undistinguished from the ordinary world, right? So you see the way in which the connection is still being seen in the immanent form, right? When it has already kind of come about in the way it has to, right? And so it is that, but that connection is only realized through personal experience, right? That's been spoken about again. And lastly, Abhinav Gupta talks about a very interesting way in which there's an intriguing method to to meditate, essentially, right? And he says that, sorry, there's a, sorry, okay, there's some comments. Okay, anyway, yeah, so there is the idea that you don't have to give up on anything, right? You don't have to kind of, because many people say that you have to give up on the worldly way of doing things, but there it says that you don't have to abandon anything, you don't have to accept anything, but you have to pause and abide in oneself, right? And that's not the only thing that he says, which is very interesting. There are a few others which are extremely interesting. And that's a way in which Shambhu or Shiva is being spoken about as something to be realized through this idea of meditation, right? Now, sorry, yeah. And this is the one that I find the most interesting, actually, in Abhinav Gupta's work, the Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika in 2.3.15. Vishvaya Chitriya Chitrasya Sambhiti Talopame Viruddha Bhava Sansparshe Paramartha Satishware. Right? So Viruddha Bhava, we're basically talking about opposites, right? What is Viruddha? Viruddha means Virodha, right? So it comes from that idea, right? And so the idea of everything that we see around us, right, within the vast canvas, the essence of that, of what is underlying that, can be thought of with the interplay of opposites, right? So when we talk about the binary, right, there's a hard binary, so to say, the interplay of the opposites and that which transcends that, right, and that which can remain even when we consider that interplay, is being spoken of in terms of Shiva, right, in this case. So the idea that the subject-object binary has to remain, or any binary, so to say, has to remain, is subsumed, is kind of dissolved within this underlying reality, right, in the Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, right? Now, the idea of dualism, right? I'll just quickly touch upon that. I am, let me just see my time, 10:13. Okay. Right. So we had started at 9:30. Right. All right. So dualism, right? In Western thought, we already touched upon some of the ways in which the subject-object binary was looked at. Now, dualism talks about two different layers of reality, right? So it could be either it's usually the empirical, the worldly sense of how we see the world, and the conceptual or the spiritual, right? So in Western thought, Descartes, there's a very famous line, the cogito ergo sum, right? Which is basically that I think, therefore I am, right? So the importance of subjective consciousness and the first perspective, right? So basically all our emotions, our scholastic tendencies, if you recall Foucault, the way he defined identity, right? It goes beyond the tangible objectivity of this world, right? So we have all come across the term qualia, right? How we look at sensations or at experiences, right? So there is a lot of discussion on how we can explain that in modern neuroscience, for instance. There are neural correlates of experiences that have been discussed about. And of course, still, however, we have what is known as the hard problem of consciousness, which has been articulated by people like David Chalmers, for instance, and how subjective experiences can come from purely physical processes, right, in the brain or in the nerves, for instance, right? Now, this is a very interesting kind of idea. Or rather illustration. So let's say, this is often given in other contexts. So let's say we have this apple, right? And you have a microscope that goes into the very nitty-gritties of the apple, the structure of the apple, so to say. You also have a way to characterize the color, right? In terms of the wavelength and frequencies. You also have a chart of, it's a taxonomy kind of chart where different kinds of apples and their structures are given, and you can identify which it could potentially be. However, in each of them, right, the idea of what is redness, for instance, right, and that is what goes back into the very, the very core of what is being spoken about here, is still something which we cannot quite describe, essentially, when we talk about the color in terms of wavelength or frequency, and that's the claim, right? That's the idea, which is that the experience of redness, right, is not quite described in terms of the characteristics that we use to parameterize it, essentially, right? So that is one illustration, and I'll come to a very famous experiment that has been spoken about, a thought experiment that takes it a little further, essentially, on the philosophical side. So when we talk about the hard problem of consciousness, right, there is often this discussion on no matter how much you give me in terms of the rigor of explanations, right, how, mechanistic model can be created, what kind of functionalities are present in the brain and in the nerves, right? You still cannot account for the essence of subjective experience, right? That's the problem that we're talking about, right? So, and so there is a question, right, that if, let's say, a certain number of functions are taking place in the brain, and that's leading to the conscious experience, why does the execution of those functions bring about the conscious experience, right? There is no kind of straightforward underlying premise, right? So that why question, right, is something that has been thought about quite a bit, right? So, for instance, there is a whole illustration in terms of what is known as philosophical zombies, right? So these are zombies, as the name suggests. They are hypothetical beings that are very much like us, except for that they do not have consciousness, right? And so whether such a person, how will that being essentially be fundamentally different from us, right? So your next question would be, how are we even defining consciousness, right? So we don't get there. We are just assuming that there is a certain set of kind of ideas with respect to consciousness that we are axiomatically almost assuming here, right? Because defining consciousness in itself is something that a number of different theories have tried to do, but have only got so far, right? And inverted qualia, of course, is the idea that one person experience of color may be completely different from another's. And in 1974, we had this very famous paper, right, by Thomas Nagel, which was to do with, if you were to become a bat, right, would you be able to, can you from now, like when you're not a bat, right, can you talk about what the experience of being a bat would be, right? So there are very interesting things which have been put across in the Western modern thought, right? And let's see how Trika Shaivism, but before that, let's see how West itself tries to, answer that, right? So you have different kinds of theories that have been put forth. So there is type A materialism, which talks about how there is no problem, essentially, right? So it basically says that this whole idea of the hard problem of consciousness is basically just a figment of fiction or figment of imagination. There's nothing hard as such. There's no problem per se, right? It's quite it can be reduced to an easy problem, right? Then you have eliminative materialism, which talks about, again, that being an illusion, right? This whole problem of phenomenal consciousness being an illusion. And then you have these three theories, right? The one which is neural correlates of consciousness, that talks about brain processes and how they give rise to consciousness. The integrated information theory, it's been flung around quite a bit in terms of trying to explain consciousness. It talks about how information that is existing about a system, different kinds of information, right? Different kinds of parameters, how if that information is integrated, then we can basically that can lead to a certain conscious experience, right? That integration of information is what is essential for conscious experience, so to say, right? So that's a very emergentist kind of idea, because it is emerging from a certain premise that there is a certain modes of information and they are being integrated in a certain manner, right? Now, global workspace theory, again, it talks about the brain and how there's a workspace, so to say, and how that leads to conscious experience, right? So we'll not go into too much detail on that, just to highlight that these are the ways in which the West has tried to do it, right? Now, the Indic perspective, right? So we all know that the Indic perspective, consciousness often has been talked about in terms of indivisible and foundational aspects of reality, right? The Nyaya Vaisheshik and various other schools, even the Jain school of thought, right? That's not always been universalized, essentially, because there have been, units, so to say, of consciousness, so to say. But otherwise, in general, it has been looked at as indivisible and foundational to reality itself, right? And so in Sankhya as well, you have the idea that there are many different kind of Purusha, right? Or units of consciousness or kind of, manifestations of consciousness, right? So in the Indic thought, right, this whole idea of the hard problem will be looked at as a false dichotomy, right? Basically, this is something which is being very, spuriously looked at only as a product of the brain, but they would rather say or advocate that there is another unified reality that underlies that, right? So, for instance, here it says, na dhyato na japataha swadhyasya vidhi purvakam evameva shiva bhasastam numo bhakti shalinam, right? So you basically have this idea that dhyana, japa, right? And swadhyaya, right? It is basically looking at how we can go ahead towards that reality, right? And it is not something that can be looked at only in terms of the empirical aspect only, right? As such. And there's a certain aspect of bhakti, right, which has to be considered as well, right? So that's just one way of thinking about it. Of course, the main emphasis in this point is to do with the false dichotomy, the idea of the false dichotomy. Philosophers such as Nagarjuna, of course, talked about consciousness as empty of existence itself. And in Kashmir Shaiva Darshan, you have Shiva, right, as the final non-dual reality, and which transcends all the empirical methods as well, and is accessible only through direct spiritual realization. Again, there is a quote that I've put here, Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, right? So you have Kartari Gyatari Swatmanyadi Siddhe Maheshware, right? So for instance, you have this idea of Kartari Gyatari, right? Where is the action and the knowledge, right? So to say. And here you see, Ajratma Nishedham Va Siddhim Va Vidhitakaha, right? So Nishedham Va Siddhim, right? So the idea that, there is what it is not and what it is and how you attain it, essentially, right? And the idea that it is beyond, basically, only through direct spiritual realization, right, that you kind of get to it, so to say, right? So I'll not focus too much on the rest of the Advaitin aspect all that much, because my talk is primarily to with Trika Shaivism. But there's an interesting bit on Vasubandhu when he talks about Abhidharma Kosha and how perception is caused by individual karma, right, and mental impressions. And within Trika Shaivism, this has been looked at in terms of Malla and vasanas, right? So impurities or veils and the individual impressions that exist. And that is where the fundamental reality is being altered to have different kinds of subjective experiences, right? So the idea of why there is an inverted qualia, for instance, right, has been looked at from this perspective in the Trika Shaivism, so to say, right? And it describes 36 tattvas, principles of reality. And it also does say that there are entities that don't have the higher level tattvas, and they in principle can be spoken of in terms of philosophical zombies, right? The point that I had raised earlier, right? So there are different tattvas and levels of tattvas, and the Shuddha Vidya, which is the pure knowledge and above, if somebody does not have that, then there isn't a capacity to do vimarsha or self-reflective awareness, right? So that's the philosophical zombie aspect that I was talking about. Now, this is a very interesting experiment, which is to do with Mary's room experiment. It was proposed in the early 1900s. It's a very well-known experiment by Frank Jackson. And it talks about if there is a lady, a scientist, not a lady necessarily, it could be anyone, a scientist, who is, historically it was described as Mary, the scientist. So that's why I mentioned woman, a scientist in a black and white world, right? So there is a black and white world. There is no color in that. And but the scientist has information about color, right? Has never seen color, has never experienced color, but the scientist can parameterize the idea of color essentially in some form, right? Now the question is that if, let's say, now for the first time the scientist encounters color, right? He or she looks at color, right? Whether what will happen, right? Will they already have known certain things about that experience, or will they gain new knowledge while that thing takes place, right? So in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, you have the idea that when this happens, basically what happens is that knowledge is already there in the fundamental reality of the universe, right? It's already part of Shiva, so to say. So the explanation that a Trika Shaiva Darshan kind of proponent would say is that you have basically a spanda, a vibration of consciousness, right, that arises, that is direct, that is transformative, right? But it is very much coming from the fundamental premise on which we are existing, right? The reality, the fundamental reality, so to say, right? So there is a sense of qualia, is experiential, is non-reductive. However, it is embedded in the fundamental reality of our consciousness, of our very existence, so to say, right? So there's a very beautiful way in which the knowledge argument or Mary's room argument can be spoken of in terms of spanda, right? Now, spanda itself, I'll just quickly go over what spanda means. Spanda is basically the idea of pulsation. Some of you may have come across this idea before as well. So there is a dynamic and creative force that, gives rise to the universe, right? There is a certain way in which it comes about as a conscious essence, in terms of a conscious essence. And this is what leads to us attuning, with the state of eternal self, right? So in the Spanda Karika, for instance, it talks about the vibration that pulsates in the universe, right? Yasya jagati spandati chetana murtihi sa devtanam vibhurachate spandaha tam gyatva spanditu mahavidyamana brahmatma bhavam pravillapya sarvada, right? So there is this idea that there is a merging of sorts. Spanditu manaha vidyamana. Manaha means, of course, the mind, right? Gyatva brahmatma bhavam pravillapya sarvada. Right, so there is a whole idea of Chetana Murti, right, in terms of the Spanda, essentially. And very interestingly, Shemaraj, who was a disciple of Abhinav Gupta, talks about the Spanda in terms of Pranava. Right, Pranava is Om. Right, we have the Pranava. So there is a one-to-one kind of connection of sorts of Spanda Rupa and Pranava. Right, the unstruck throb of active ideation that is being spoken about in the Netra Tantra right? So that is it's a commentary by Shemaraju, who was a disciple of Abhinav Gupta. Now, let's come a little away from this towards Spanda is vibration, fluctuation, right? Now, in science, right, if I were to ask you whether fluctuations play a role, it so happens that it does play a very important role, right? And quantum fluctuations in particular, I mean, if there are any physicists here, they would know that when the universe was kind of evolving at that time, there was a certain point in the trajectory when the evolution happened very quickly, right? And in a very abrupt manner, in a very fast manner, which was the inflationary period. And there were certain kinds of quantum fluctuations that were kind of, otherwise quantum fluctuations arise and go back into the firmament, into the fundamental field, so to say, right? But in that period, because it was moving so fast or expanding so fast, that had a non-trivial effect on the structures that were formed in the universe, right? So there was a formation of cosmic structures based on the fluctuations aspect as well, right? So just a thought that I would like you to keep as we take the discussion along. This is just a visualization of fluctuations, quantum fluctuations, that is quite well, I think it's more in terms of CMBs, but anyway. Non-dualism, when we talk about non-dualism, right? Non-dualism has been spoken of in Vedic and Agamic traditions both, right? So in Rig Veda, of course, you have, Ekam Sad Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, right? Which is basically that God is one, but you see it in many different ways. Now, in the Karma Kand, right, you have different kinds of aspects covered on that front. So Nasadya Sukta, of course, talks about the idea of how the fundamental reality existed before the multiplicity that we see around us. Ritam, the cosmic order, is spoken of course, in the Rig Vedic tradition. And commentaries by Sayan, for instance, talks about the Advaitic interpretation of these texts, right? Very interestingly, in the Shukla Yajurved, you have the idea of Shiva, or rather Rudra, in a different form as a non-dual entity in Rudradhyay, right? And then you have the Taittiriya Samhita of Krishna Yajurved also, where you have non-dualism. Brahmans, right? Where there are different kinds of Brahmans of the four Veds. Taittiriya Brahman, for instance, of Krishna Yajurved, Samvidhan Brahman, and the Tadya Brahman of the Samved also illustrate this, aspect. The non-dual, this is also seen in the Jnana Kand, right? Not only the Karma Kand, the Jnana Kand, in that you have the Aetariya Aranyak, the Kaushitaki Aranyak, and the Brihad Aranyak, right? And that is very much seen in Kathopanishad, where very interestingly, it is spoken of as a fire, right? This non-dual reality is spoken of as a fire, which burns and which kind of leads to the various things that we see around us, right? So, Agniyarthako, Bhuvanam Pravishto, Rupam Rupram Pratirupo Bhabuva, right? Ekastata Sarva Bhutantaratma, Rupam Rupam Pratirupo Bahishcha. So here you have Agnir Yatheko, right? Which is basically, you have the non-dual fire, the reality in terms of the fire, right? And then the Rupam Rupam Pratirupo Bhabuva, right? So you have basically the idea of the different kinds of forms that you see around us. And, it becomes different according to whatever it enters, essentially, right? So the fire, what it enters, it becomes different because of that. Okay, sorry, let me just see if there is a... Yes, it does. It does. I'll come to those questions. Yeah, very interesting questions. Some of them I've been seeing that. So here I wouldn't go too much into this. So Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad, of course, talks about this as well. And the Brahma Sutra, Badarayan, absolute kind of, foundational text, right, for Advaita. And then you have also, very interestingly, the Agamic traditions, right? So there you have, in terms of Shaiva and Shakta traditions, right, there are a lot of aspects where the Pancharatragama, for instance, the Vaishnava text, though, presents Shakti, who is identified as the sentient principle, right, which is basically looking at the non-dualism again in a slightly different way. Okay, sorry. So this is just a kind of overview of the different Shaiva traditions, so to say. Shaiva Siddhanta, of course, looks at both Vedic and Agamic traditions. Very popular in southern India, especially. Shrikanta school of Vishishtadvaita Shaivism, for instance, looks at the non-dualistic aspect. Then you have Shrikant's work also with the Brahma Mimamsa Bhashya, right, which is looking at this aspect of Shiva as both the creator of Veda and Agama, right? And this is interesting because just like in Pranava and Spanda Rupa, there is an equivalence being drawn between two traditions that have often not been kept in the same fold necessarily, right? So there's a very clear-cut kind of equivalence being drawn background of sorts in terms of the origin, so to say, right? So Shripati's Vishesh Advaita also talks about non-duality, of course. In Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, you have this individuation defined in terms of qualified evolution from this ultimate reality of Shiva. And in that, you have Spandakarika, Pratyabhignya, of course. The interesting part about Trika Shaiva Darshan or Kashmiri Shaivism is the concept of Pratyabhignya, right? This concept that I just mentioned right now. So Pratyabhignya is basically the idea of recognition, right? Or the direct realization of the self, right? And so the key texts, for instance, there are a lot of the texts that speak about it in terms of, for instance, Swachanda, Bhairava, Tirumandiram. These are aspects, the key texts and doctrines, both, right? Which have resonances with what have been spoken of in the Ishvara Pratyabhignya Karika, right? As well as in other texts like Shemaraj, for instance, and I'll come to that shortly. Okay, so Pratyabhignya, as I said, is basically the core, basically one of the core profound philosophical ideas in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, and the idea of direct recognition, right? The direct aspect of recognition, and the equivalence of the microcosm and the macrocosm, of course. And so there are many different texts. For instance, Vashu Gupta has spoken about it quite a bit. And he talks about the transcendence of the duality of subject and object, right? The very first theme that I had started with. Shomananda talks about Shaiva Dvaita, right? He looks at different kinds of Buddhist and Vedantic philosophies. The very important part is there was a lot of interfacing and discussion between various Buddhism, of course, and Vedanta, but also we often forget, or we don't know rather, that there was a whole school of thought from Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, which was also very much, looking at different aspects of reality thereof, right? Utpal Dev, he looked at Pratyabhignya particularly. That was his main, thought, center point of thought, right? And how the inherent divine nature of the self can be realized. Abhinav Gupta, I already mentioned about him in passing. He looked at Utpal Dev's teachings, and he had this more rigorously defined, right? This philosophy more rigorously defined. And the interesting part is, which we often kind of mistake for this whole idea of Kashmiriyat. We talk about Kashmiriyat, the poetry and the music and various aspects of it, right? There is a famous song also, which I think some of you may have heard about, which is Hookus Pookus, this song that has been played in movies also, I think, quite a bit, right? And there, if you go into the nitty-gritties of that, the lyrics of that is actually talking about a Shaiva aspect, so to say, right? And the aesthetics, the poetics, right, of how we propose the philosophy and how we take it forward, right? Abhinav Gupta had a lot of role to play in that quite a while back, actually, right? So in Tantra Lok, of course, he talks about that as well. And Shemaraja, his works were basically Pratyabhignya Hridayam and Spanda Sandoha, right? He looked at, again, looking at it from a more holistic point of view and looking at the reality as it was changing. So you have to understand that these were over hundreds of years, right? They were, separated by a few hundred years at least, a few of them. So the correlative aspect of how this was developing also had to be considered while we are looking at their works and contextualizing it in the broader picture. Okay. Now, one important question that comes about is, how is Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan different from Advait Vedanta, right? We are both talking about non-duality. So what is so different about it, right? So the idea is that in Pratyabhignya school of thought, you have the idea of Shiva and the divine power Shakti, which is the interplay of that is creating the idea of whatever is seen in nature, right? And so this is a real expression of Shiva's conscious play, right? This is part of the Leela of Shiva, so to say, right? And so there is no essential, and this is the important bit, essential separation between the universe and the divine, right? So the idea of essential separation, in Advaita Vedanta, you have the aspect of the veiled side of reality, the projective aspect of reality, so to say, right? So in that, for instance, you have a slightly more dualistic view in the sense that it's not dualistic in that sense, but there is a certain qualifying kind of aspect on why the separation is coming about, right? Whereas in this case, it is much more non-essential. There's no essential separation, right? So for instance, in Advaita, we talk about Maya and Avidya, right? And there's a whole idea of unreality or illusory aspect, so to say, right? So there's a very famous wording, of course, Jagan Mithya, which I'm sure you've come across. And so there are different kinds of realities also. There is absolute reality, Paramarthika Sattva. There is Vyavaharika Sattva, and then there is Pratibhashika Sattva as well, right? So I'm not going to too much on that because that would take me away into Advaita. Now, in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, there is no dismissal of the empirical world, right? There is just an integration with the framework of the divine consciousness, right? And so there is the difference of how we articulate it, right? So it is spoken of in terms of this term called abhasa, right? So there is this term called abhasa, which is basically it also means to shine forth, right? To kind of be expressed, right? And there are various kinds of abhasa. There's bahya abhasa and barintastiti abhasa, right? And there are different kinds of realities with respect to that, right? So Abhinav Gupta also looks at different layers of reality. He also talks about sattas, right? He talks about Maya as well, right? But there is a certain integration aspect of it, integrative aspect of it, which has been looked at more closely than in the Advaita school of thought, the Vedantin school of thought, right? One important aspect at the very end that I have mentioned here, which is interesting. So there is a certain way in which Pratyabhijna connects deeply with the Sankhya system as well, right? So there are people who have worked on this, and Utpal mentions about 23 kinds of objects and different kinds of cognitive organs as well. Now, when we talk about Sankhya and Advaita Vedanta, the idea of ahankara, I had spoken about it in the beginning, is very important. And Advaita does not treat ahankara as a separate substance or very early in its evolutionary chart of reality, right? So it looks at it in the context of buddhi and manas and so on. Whereas in the Sankhyan school of thought, it is much more kind of fundamental than in Advaita. So because of Pratyabhijna's alignment with that, right, there are certain elements where the role of ahankara is very interesting to look at, right? I'll not go into too much on that, but just to kind of mention this point, which I found quite interesting as well. So Abhasavad and Vivartavad, this is the fundamental difference between Advaita Vedanta and Pratyabhijna. Abhasavad is basically the idea of abhasa, to shine or to appear, to manifest essentially. And Vivartavad is basically the idea in Advaita Vedanta that the effect pre-exists in the cause, right? So where if there is a universe, right, that is illusory, there's a superimposition upon the Brahman, the ultimate cause, and within that cause, there is this pre-existing effect, so to say, right? So there is no non-difference between cause and effect, right, of sorts. And so it is an indefinable illusion, as it is called, neither real nor unreal, right? So the idea of Abhasavad and Vivartavad are the ways in which the non-dualism is qualified, essentially, right? So that is where the difference fundamentally comes about. And in such schools of thought, this Maya exists, but it is often, qualified as because of the glory of Shiva, or you could say the, inherent paradoxical emanations of Shiva, so to say, right? Whereas the other side, it talks about Maya being a very fundamental layer of reality itself, which has been around, which will be around, forevermore, right? So that is how it has been spoken of in, Advaita, for instance, right? So, so that's very important. Okay, so that's the idea, right? That there is a certain kind of dichotomy of annotating a conceptual and physicalist reality, right, through this veil of projections, whereas in that case, it's much more integrative in how we are defining it, right? So now, if we talk about the quantum realm, right? Quantum mechanics, as I was saying, is already, I've spoken about it a little bit. The idea of superposition becomes very important. What does it mean? Superposition basically talks about how one system can have a multiplicity of states, right? A multiplicity of realities in a certain attribute with respect to a certain attribute, right? So for instance, if I were to say that a table is red and black and blue and green at the same time, till the point I observe it, and I observe it to be, let's say, black or brown, whatever it is, right? And then it remains as that color that I've observed, right? So there's a way of in which superposition is described, and my act of observation is seen to be very, very fundamental. Not mine necessarily, but any act of observation is seen as very fundamental to describing how the system, what the system state is thereafter, and how it will move forward, right? Then there are aspects of, for instance, duality, right? Of wave-like and particle-like nature, right? Which is, again, very paradoxical in a certain manner of speaking, but is very interesting nonetheless. And uncertainty I've already described about, right? If we go a little further in the scientific trajectory, of the world, then you have quantum field theory, which talks about how relativity and quantum mechanics is unified or of sorts. But I won't go into too much detail on the technical side. But one interesting part on that is that it looks at particles, right, as excitations of fundamental fields in nature, right, that extend through space and time, for instance. And the idea that, this is just something that emerges. And then there is an annihilation operator, for instance, in quantum field theory that talks about how it goes back essentially into the field, so to say, right? And now we have the standard model, which talks about the fundamental particles again, and the forces as well. And you all have heard about the Higgs boson, that's also part of it, right? But in all of this, right, there is one question that still remains, which is, where does the conceptual and the empirical come together or diverge, right? This is the debate which has been the metaphysical premise of the quantum realm, right? So for instance, if I were to talk about Roger Penrose, right? He's a well-known physicist. So many of you may have read his works, right? He talks about what it means to be in a state of superposition, right? He has this very famous quotation, right? We must simply accept that this indeed is a kind of description that we have to adopt for quantum level systems. Such superpositions constitute an important part of the actual construction of our micro world, as has now been revealed to us by nature, right? And so on and so forth. And he talks about how, if you were to have, the descriptions are perfectly clear cut and they provide us with a micro world that evolves according to a description that is indeed mathematically precise and moreover completely deterministic. It's a very interesting, I mean, but again, it comes to this whole idea of what it means to be in superposition. But I would just quickly like to go back to the question I was asking, which is that what is conceptual and what is empirical? How do we define this boundary, so to say, right? And that has been the question about dualism. So, when we talked about spirituality and the tangible world, right? So in this, in the quantum realm, the wave function, right, is very, very important, right? What is the wave function? The wave function is basically what has been spoken of in terms of the descriptor, right? This is mathematically, we talk about complex valued functions. And the wave function encodes the information about a quantum system, right? Its properties, various kinds of properties can be, accessed from it with the operation of, Bhupendraji, I think you had a question. Or rather, I think the time is,
Mrittunjoy ji, you can wrap up soon and then we can take the questions.
Okay, yeah, I'll quickly try to kind of, bring this discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the wave function, basically why I brought it here is because there are two schools of thought in physics, which is to do with the psi-ontic and psi-epistemic school of thought. Psi is basically the wave function, right? The symbol for the wave function is usually used as a psi. So the psi-ontic school of thought says the wave function is an actual reality, element of reality, right? It's an actual thing, right? So for instance, Bohmian mechanics, right? David Bohm, for instance, he talks about wave function being an actual wave, right? Which carries the particle in a certain manner, right? The psi-epistemic school of thought talks about it as just a descriptor of reality, right? It doesn't talk about anything more, right? So this idea of how much we are giving a reality to this idea of the wave function is very important, because even within the Bharatiya Jñāna Parampara, the whole idea of the divide, essentially the dualistic divide, is to do with the empirical and the spiritual or the conceptual, so to say, right? And that is where Trika Shaivism, I've already come across what are the different ways in which it has come together. I won't go too much into this because of lack of time. These are just some of the people who have contributed seminally to quantum mechanics, of course, and a very well-known quote of Albert Einstein, where he talks about different contradictory pictures of reality, right? So the idea here is the counterintuitive paradoxical aspect, right, is something, again, which has been categorically spoken of in the Trika Shaivism metaphysics as well, right, in a very different way, not only in the interplay of opposites, but also in terms of the paradoxical nature inherent in Shiva's glory, right, and so on and so forth. I'll come to that. This, I wouldn't go too much into it. This is basically a description of I've already gone across some of these ideas in quantum physics, superposition and reality, so to say. And so quantum logic, right? Quantum logic, again, looks at the act of observation. There is also the idea of non-commutativity. Right? This is a very important aspect in mathematical sense, which says that if you have a certain sequence of operations that happen, and if you were to shuffle the sequence, so to say, if you change the steps in the way they happen, there would be a non-trivial difference in the final outcome, right? So there's a difference in the way it will emerge, right? And there is a certain work in Trika Shaivism, actually not one, quite a few, where the interplay of Shiva Shakti and the manner in which it happens, there's almost a point of hysteresis. There's a point of how this sequence and the manner of this manifestation is very sequential and very unique in its own way, right? So there is a interesting kind of paradigm, so to say, in the non-commutative kind of metaphysics, so to say, right? The idea of interconnectedness, of course, is important, and I don't think I have much time for that, but in the discussions, I hope to kind of come across this area of my work or this area of discussion, entanglement, right? People have come across this entanglement, the idea of correlations in nature, right? So Einstein was not very happy with the idea of entanglement, the idea that two different quantum systems can remain non-trivially connected, so to say, right? Even if they were to be spatially separated, for instance. This has been a part of research very much so for me, as well as largely in the world out there. And Leonard Susskind, of course, talked about how Niels Bohr and Einstein, these two people that you see here, fundamentally, we're talking about whether nature is deterministic or probabilistic. And in that discussion, suddenly Albert Einstein, with two of his colleagues, tried to put forth this very weird kind of conceptual thought experiment of sorts to propose that there is something spooky about the quantum world. And from there, the whole discussion of entanglement came about, right? So Leonard Susskind talks about that and how these debates of Niels Bohr and Einstein led to a lot of non-trivial kind of results in the world of physics, so to say, right? So who will bell Schrödinger's cat? I wouldn't have much time for this, but the idea that this idea of entanglement was, taken forward by John Bell, right? And, the recently 2022 Nobel Prize was for the experimental verification of this as such, right? So entanglement is basically, as I just mentioned, this is a global state of a composite system when they cannot be represented as part of separate subsystems, right? When they have to be looked at as one whole, right? There is no separation that can be spoken of in the logical sense as well as in the actual empirical sense, so to say, right? So there is a certain aspect of integrative connectedness, interconnectedness, which has been used in many different applications as well, right? So this is one of the first real-time images of entanglement, right? You can see there are certain specks that you see. The light in one of these blobs that you see and the light in the other, there is a correlative aspect between these two sets of specks that you see out there, right? So that is how entanglement is seen in the laboratory with a setup which was in Austria, right? Okay, let me just go forward. So there are many ways in which entanglement is useful. So my last part of my talk today would be on non-absolutism, the idea that there isn't anything which is absolute in the sense of being sacrosanct, right? In the world of physics, we have seen a gradual movement away from absolutism towards successive demolition of absolutist ideas, right? So for instance, in space-time, in terms of the field and particles, let's say, even in terms of the laws of physics, right? So right now, there are about 108 theories of supergravity, if I'm not mistaken, could be a little more actually now. And there is a certain degree of redundancy of theoretical articulation, right? So there are different theories that can describe nature up to a certain regime, to a sufficient degree of correctness, right? So what is correct, what is absolute is being questioned very much so within the physics domain, right? So non-absolutism is not absolute. This line is something very important for index systems because non-absolutism itself, right? When you say non-absolutism, you are making an absolute right there, right? So that itself is non-absolute, and therefore there is an infinite regress of how you negate absolutism altogether, right? So that is what I think, even in the Nasadya Sukta, there was some question that came about, and I'd love to address that as well. And so the idea in Trika Shaivism is that the non-duality, right, is also in the absolute aspect of Shiva as well, right? There is an ultimate, reality of Shiva, right, where the idea of absolutes is being transcended altogether. And this comes about in the binary oppositions, right? In Abhinav Gupta's that specific shlok, for instance, and a few others as well. And in Tantra Lok also, there is an idea that different paths can lead to the final reality, so to say, within the Shaiva Darshan Parampara, right? So that is important. And Niels Bohr again talks about paradoxes. I've already spoken about it. Paradoxes as in very different ways of looking at the world. And subjective and objective sides themselves are not absolute, right? So Niels Bohr talks about how, even objectivity and subjectivity themselves, splitting this reality into an objective and a subjective world won't get us very far, right? So that's what he says. Now, epistemological resonances, these are some ways in which the methods of knowledge generation in both Trika Shaivism and quantum mechanics are often very similar. So there is pratyaksha, experiential knowledge that is very important. Of course, observation by definition is pratyaksha, right? The interconnectedness aspect of it, the correlative aspect, there's a whole expansion on that in the book as well. And the theoretical frameworks, the non-absoluteness of the theoretical frameworks. In the Trika Shaivism, there is very specific points of reference where you see the demolition or the dismantling of some of these constructs that have been taken or that have taken place for explaining what the people have been, the seers have been seeing. And the same goes with the quantum aspect, or rather the modern physics aspect as well, with the idea of conceptual redundancies and the contemplative inquiry and counterintuitive possibilities, right? Things which are not quite intuitive and reconcilable often, right? In the logical sense is often being spoken of both in quantum mechanics and in Trika Shaivism. Again, need for caution. This is what I started with. We have to be very careful. There are contextual differences in the two schools of thought, of course. They have very different interpretations and perspectives within their own folds, right? So in quantum mechanics, there are a number of different pilot wave theory, Copenhagen interpretation, and so on and so forth. There are distinct conceptual terminologies, right? We have to be very careful. They're connecting different realms, right? There may be a metaphysical resonance, but the direct application of that or the instantiation of that resonance or the metaphysics is in slightly different domains in the two areas. But there are very interesting kind of parallels in the premise itself, right? That's the interesting bit. And the methodologies, of course, some of them are not quite the same because of the modeling, and the tools that are used thereof, right? So this is the book that has come out, right? It has been published by the Penguin Random House group, particularly Hay House, which looks at science and spirituality, has done that in the past. And yeah, so I'll keep it to that, and I'll look forward to the discussions. Ji.
Hey, so thank you very much, Dr. Guha Majumdar. It is, I mean, I would say quite an effort to drill down very complicated terms and try to explain it to our audience and to, in fact, even whoever will read your book. And now we'll take the questions. We have some questions in the chat which came up prior.
Yeah, I'll try to address some of them.
Yeah. So I think the first one was about from Sunil Kumar. How exactly would you define consciousness? Would AI robots, if they attain sentience? Yeah, okay, so you can take that question.
And, yeah. So that's a very interesting question, because I think that has been yesterday itself. We were having this, there's this event that happened in Shanghai. I don't know if some of you may have followed this, where a robot kind of, kidnapped another robot, right? I mean, so a robot kind of had a set of questions it asked, and there was a set of responses. And then there was a possibility, there's a conjectural possibility that why don't you come with me, because you're not facing the optimum, work-life balance, so to say, in quotation marks. And then the robot followed, right? So the idea of sentience, right, is something we have yet not quite crossed, right? Because to an extent, yes, I mean, if you look at generative AI, for instance, today, you have a lot of independence of, intellectual agency in a way, right? But when you have the idea of reflexivity, right, that's the important bit, self-aware reflexivity that we have still not reached per se, right? So the definition of consciousness, that's a very, very loaded question, right? So I can only presume to address it in terms of the ways that it has been done in the Western world, in the scientific world, right? As well as in the modern in the Indic thought, right? So you have in Trika Shaivism, it is often spoken of as I said, as immutable again, right? It is something which is indescribable because of the way in which, it defies the binary or the rationalist kind of construction even, right? And therefore it is beyond that. In the modern scientific term, as I said, it is more emergentist, right? There is an emergence aspect of it. So for instance, in the neural correlate aspect, you have the idea of neural kind of responses and the construction of the neural correlates. In integrated information, for instance, you have different modes of information and how the integration happens in phi. There is this function that Giulio Tononi writes about. So that again is not something which is fundamental, right? That is something which emerges from different axiomatic premises and different units that have been looked at as the fundamental units of information, right? We're still at the level of information, so to say, right? So I would say that we are still a little way away from, I think, being able to, even assume to reconcile some of these, resonances, so to say. But these are the ways they have been addressed. Yeah.
Yeah, you can take the next one, the Nasadya Sukta.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the Nasadya Sukta for exactly that, right? And I love that it is so skeptical and so agnostic in its own approach. The idea that even the gods, so to say, may not know about the reality beyond, right? Or maybe they do, or maybe they don't. So the idea that, the participatory aspect, right? That is what I would like to highlight here. The participatory aspect of the universe, which Archibald Wheeler, for instance, in Science talks about, modern science, where your participation and your interpretation is as important, if not more, than the objective premise or the tangible reality that you assume it to be, right? So in the Nasadya Sukta, there is a certain aspect of agential realism also, as I see it, right? Because the whole idea of skepticism, right, is leaving an open-ended aspect to it. Of course, that is also because the fundamental reality is spoken of as beyond description altogether, right, or even beyond any construct, so to say. So that is a very interesting way of highlighting and defining reality in a manner of speaking. And I completely agree that, there is a sufficient, fairly high degree of skepticism that is seen in the Nasadya Sukta. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bhupendraji,
Bhupendraji, can you please go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Mrittunjoy. Your name itself is Shiva. So, and it was a beautiful presentation. I just wanted to, because in 1975, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, in one talk, he said, Shivam Shantam Advaitam Chaturtham Manyante Sa Atma Sa Vigyayaha. That means Chaturtham Manyante. That is, Shiva is what he described as Chaturtha, that is the fourth state of consciousness. And that fourth state of consciousness, and then he said that that is nothing but the vacuum state, or the least excitation state, or the ground state. And he brought one verse from Kathopanishad. He said, Anoranyan Mahato Mahyan. What is the range of this Shiva? That Anoranyan, it is Anu means it is Sukshma se Sukshmatam. That is, it is the and the Mahato Mahyan, that is greater than the greatness. You know, and so this is the range. And you said the second thing you said, and at the same time, Swami Shivananda also gave in his commentary on Mandukya Upanishad, verse 7. It is the same verse, but he said it is indescribable because it cannot be described. It is Swataha Siddha, that is self-apparent. Swataha Siddha. And Bhagavan Shankaracharya also said, no, it cannot be described, because how it can be described, the language fails, because language can describe on the basis of class, quality, action, relationship, and naming. So this cannot be described. All language fails to describe. And then once, and you said Virodhabhas, that is interplay. Interplay of two opposite forces. So that is what Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. He is advising Arjuna in Sankhya Yoga, that is chapter 2, that Taigunya Vishaya Veda Naistre Gunyo Bhavarjuna Nirdvando Nitya Satvastho Niryogakshem Atmavan. So he is very important because our life is nothing but the interplay of three gunas. And lastly, he says Atmavan. So when one meditates, and every day meditates, then he is stress-free, worry-free. His nervous system is purified, cultured. And when he comes out, then he becomes Atmavan. He's possessed of the self. And when he's possessed of the self, then in his day-to-day activities, he has that self as a Sakshi Bhav, witnessing quality. And that witnessing quality, that is the dynamism, and that is Vishnu quality. And that Dr. John Hagelin, yesterday I was with
sorry, Bhupendraji, sorry to interrupt.
I'm completing.
No, do you have a specific question? Or so if you have a question, if you could ask that, then it'll be great. And you can continue your discussion with Dr. Majumdar later, offline. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you have a question, Bhupendraji?
I just had a question about this two opposite, the Virodhabhas, the interplay of two opposite forces. So if we can highlight a little bit, that would be great.
Right. I think that, as you rightly said, I mean, firstly, before I go to that, I think it's very interesting you mentioned about Mahesh Yogiji, because, I mean, I have been working very closely with Professor Brian Josephson. And as you may know, that he has also had previously been quite closely associated with Mahesh Yogiji. And part of this book has this section which is to do with self-selected fluctuations, right? Which is something I've been working on. And that's purely kind of physics. There's nothing much with respect to metaphysics per se. But the idea that there are ways in which, fluctuations themselves self-organize, right? In a very kind of emergentist way, so to say, but also in terms of there is a natural tendency for that to happen. And I see that as something in a different context, as also the Spanda, the pulsations, right? Self-organizing, self kind of creating, right? This whole idea of the universe, what we see around us. So there is a beautiful aspect and connection that I just wanted to highlight here. Now, the interplay of opposites, right? I mean, that is something which in dharmic traditions, not only in Trika Shaivism, but elsewhere as well, has been seen and you know, in a dramatic way as well at times. For instance, we all are familiar with the idea of Ninda Stuti, right? There is this idea that devotion by censure, right? Which is amazing, right? You don't hear about something like that in any other kind of, you know, religious fold. I mean, at least as far as I know, I mean, I'm open to being corrected on that. But the idea that you can have censure and you can have devotion at the same time, right? Because the premise of where existence is fundamentally is often beyond these opposites, right? This binary itself is a construct, right? So your way of approach, right, and your characterization of where you align, in what way you align, is something which is you know, is not again absolutist, right? It cannot be absolute, and therefore this beautifully comes out in you know, both Trika Shaivism and in various other you know, modes of spirituality, so to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Prabhat Tiwari ji, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, sir. I am audible, sir.
Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Sarvebhyo Namo Namah. Greetings to all of you. I am from Kasi, and I have just finished my PG in Sanskrit Vyakarana, Paniyan grammar, and philosophy too. So, sir, I am much interested in this topic, quantum physics, and I have done some work, and I actually investigate how can we correlate these two idea in Eastern and Western. So,
Right.
sir, first I wish to ask a question. Sir, first I am thankful to you, and I appreciate your presentation. That is very beautiful explanation, sir. And sir, first I want to know, sir, what is the area? Actually, I am interested in philosophy of physics. There is the problem, measurement problem. So, philosophy of physics, they are the philosophers who are working on these problems. Philosophers, sir, how can we correlate these two? There is physics, and this is the Eastern philosophy, and so many times Western scientists and philosophers write this Eastern realism, not philosophy. And sir, and as I have told that I am working in this, so one of paper from David Chalmers, he wave function collapse and consciousness. In that paper, he mentioned that after the Christoph Popper, the Tao of Physics, as you know, there is the book who correlate these ideas. So to see, he mentioned that after that book, these scientists and philosophers is not interested in these Eastern religious thought. So, sir, how can we correlate? And if we correlate, where is the research paper? Sir, you are best academician, and I have read your journey. And sir, can you provide any research paper? How can we correlate it? And there is a way how can I pursue my PhD in this subject? So, sir, I need guidance, sir.
Yeah. So very, very good question. Thank you for that. So, so firstly, you mentioned about Fridtjof Capra. Yeah. So Fridtjof Capra, I mean, wrote his book in the, you know, about a few decades back, quite a few decades back. And if you see his approach, I mean, it does touch upon a lot of aspects of, you know, Eastern philosophy, Taoism, even you know, Hindu philosophy, so to say. But it is not quite embedded within that. I mean, and I'll try to highlight or qualify what I'm saying there. In my book, for instance, I have started with the Trika Shaivism as my very first section altogether, right? So it's not that I am, so there's often a very important thing or a very unfortunate thing that happens. You supplant theories or concepts from science into a certain existing kind of framework, right? A certain philosophical framework, right? So for instance, Hegel, I think Daviji mentioned about this. Hegel talks about it in terms of string theory and in terms of supersymmetry. He talks about the tanmatras in terms of the essential fields that exist, right? The fermionic and the bosonic fields, and so on and so forth, right? So वहाँ पे क्या कर रहे हैं कि वहाँ पे already जो एक दिया हुआ theory है science में, we are trying to supplant it into a theory of the Indic philosophy, right? And I find that a bit of an ad hoc method of doing it, right? Because that's basically that you're blindly connecting the dots, right? Whereas in this one, I kind of have left it, not only have I said that there are divergences and there are various contextual differences you have to highlight, but I've also tried to see where from a Bharatiya perspective from the scratch, from the get-go, right? You can have aspects that that eventually come and converge to something that the Western science has also seen independently, right? Instead of just supplanting it, right? If that makes sense. So that is something that I find very, very important. Now, the question about your research, right? How you will publish the research. That's a very big question, not only in terms of this, but in terms of IKS in general, right? जब हम science and विज्ञान की बात करते हैं and जब हम ये भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा और आधुनिक विज्ञान की बात करते हैं, there is a lot of places where you cannot quite publish in established journals, right? There are a lot of, for instance, if I were to tomorrow go and talk about the foundational aspects of elastic forces and I don't know, hydrodynamics in the Indian philosophies or Indian schools of thought, there would be a degree of skepticism, and I have seen that firsthand as well, right? So we cannot deny that, right? There is an element of that. So usme kya hai, there are some places where now journals are slowly coming up. For instance, national जो science communication and policy research है यहाँ पे दिल्ली में ही है, they have a bunch of journals that they have recently begun with. इसमें से एक scientific temper वाला एक है, and there are a few others as well. They are more open to the possibility of thinking about these intersections. Now, the point where these intersections can be even more useful, like in my case, for instance, I've tried to often see how pedagogy, right, just say education practices may, the insights from metaphysics, the insights from these intersections, how they can help in terms of creative pedagogical innovations or practices, right, is something that I am deeply interested in. Right. So when you are connecting these aspects in a utilitarian manner, in a way which is relevant to the mandate of those journals, right, then it becomes much more kind of possible to kind of orient it in that way. Right. Having said that, I would like to see in the years ahead something which does not need to do that kind of restructuring or that kind of, you know, placement. I call it placement only, right? But that we still do not have beyond a point, right? So you have प्रज्ञा लोक आपने शायद सुना होगा, रामकृष्ण मिशन का है, एक दो और भी वो है, इंडियन काउंसिल ऑफ फिलोसॉफिकल रिसर्च, वहाँ पे भी साइंस एंड फिलोसफी के विषय में काम होता है. There are papers that are being published in various schools of thought. So if you are interested, we can have a conversation, you know, after this talk as well, and we can discuss it in a little more detail. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. And sir, I'm interested in discussion, sir. I have a more.
Bilkul, I look forward to that. Yeah, I look forward to that. जी, Sunil ji, आप जी.
Hello, am I audible?
जी जी, बताएं.
Namaste. Yeah, Dr. Majumdar, fascinating lecture. So it's getting quite late, so I'll be short. As in, is your book available on Amazon? And secondly, will a recording of this lecture be available? I'm asking the organizers. And the third thing is, all of these concepts, as in originally expounded in Sanskrit, and now we are conversing in English. Say in the future, there is, I'm just speculating, sort of an SF scenario. If we have a totally different lingua franca or whatever universal language, so isn't our thought process conditioned by the language we use, as in to understand the concepts or as an iterate further?
I get what you're saying. Yes. Okay, so about the book, yes. So initially it has been launched in the Indian markets, and there is a Kindle version that's going to be available on Amazon. I have been in touch with the publishers. I'll let the organizers know here. I think the talk itself will be available on YouTube under the Toronto Indic Seminars series. The last point is very much of interest to me, because today also we were discussing about कि अगर हम भारतीय सोच को भारत से मतलब in the geocentric sense से हटा के देखें, या can it be taken beyond that, right? Why is it conditioned to be only discussed in terms of that? And in your case, you have mentioned about the linguistic aspect of it, right? So I would just say that, well, I don't think it is, right? I mean, it is not necessarily confined to, any one framework per se, and that is the beauty of it, right? Because you do see resonances of that in many different independent areas of social dynamics, of culture as such. And I think that is what makes it beautiful, is that it is very fundamental and very spiritual in its conception, right? Which is, again, defying identity, constructs, and so on and so forth. तो आपकी जो ये आपने बताई है ये चीज़, ये मैं ज़रूर मानूंगा, एंड मैं तो चाहूँगा कि हमारे हिंदी में भी, हिंदी भाषा में भी या संस्कृत में भी जितना हो पाए बातचीत हो, इसमें जो भी चर्चा होनी है वो हो पाए. But at the moment, because of various considerations, we're having that in English. But I don't think it's contingent as such. It's just that the mode of delivery or the mode of sharing of it at whatever time it had been done was done in that language. But I don't think it is only confined to that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we will stop here. So thank you once again, Dr. Guha Majumdar, for taking the time to speak to us about a very complicated topic and trying to explain it in very layman terms. Again, the audience, whoever is interested in furthering this discussion, they can reach out to Dr. Majumdar personally and take the conversation forward. And yes, our recording will be available on our channel. It is Index Studies Toronto. There's a YouTube channel, and you will see the recording in a couple of days. Dr. Mazumdar has posted his email address there on the chat. You can use it. And thank you once again, everybody. We hope to see you soon. Good day. Bye.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.